Margaret Sinclair played the organ at St. Mary's Cathedral for 30 years, beloved by everyone in Cedar Brook, Tennessee. But when the new young pastor arrived, her religious devotion transformed into a deadly obsession that would leave the congregation praying for salvation from one of their own. Before we get to this wonderful story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the story. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Cathedral, casting rainbow patterns across the polished wooden pews as Margaret Sinclair's fingers danced across the organ keys with practiced precision. At 56, she had been the church organist for 3 decades, her life as predictable and comforting as the hymns she played every Sunday morning. Margaret lived alone in a modest Victorian house just 2 blocks from the cathedral, her days structured around prayer, practice, and service to the congregation that had become her entire world. She had never married, dedicating herself instead to what she believed was a higher calling, serving God through music and devotion to St. Mary's community. But beneath Margaret's pious exterior and gentle demeanor lurked a possessive darkness that would soon be awakened by the arrival of a charismatic young pastor, whose very presence would transform her holy devotion into something far more sinister. "That was beautiful as always, Margaret," said Father Thomas McKenna as he approached the organ following the conclusion of Sunday morning service. At 34, he was the youngest pastor St. Mary's had ever had, with dark hair, kind brown eyes, and the sort of warm smile that made parishioners feel genuinely cared for. Margaret's fingers lingered on the keys as she turned to face him, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of playing. Father McKenna had been at St. Mary's for only 3 weeks, but already Margaret found herself thinking about him far more than was appropriate for a devout woman. "Thank you, Father," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working on some new arrangements that I think would complement your sermon style beautifully." Father McKenna's expression brightened with genuine interest. "I'd love to hear them sometime. Your musical knowledge is really impressive. I can tell you put a lot of thought into choosing pieces that enhance the spiritual message." The praise sent a warm flush through Margaret's chest, and she found herself studying the way Father McKenna's eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. For the first time in her 56 years, Margaret Sinclair was experiencing feelings that went far beyond Christian fellowship. "Perhaps we could schedule some time to discuss the musical program for the upcoming Easter services," Margaret suggested, her voice taking on a breathless quality she didn't quite recognize. "That's a wonderful idea," Father McKenna replied. "Why don't you stop by my office tomorrow afternoon? We could go over the liturgical calendar and plan some special arrangements." As Father McKenna walked away to greet other parishioners, Margaret remained seated at the organ bench, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her sheet music. The prospect of a private meeting with the young pastor filled her with an anticipation that was both thrilling and deeply troubling. Margaret had always prided herself on the purity of her faith and the propriety of her conduct. But something about Father McKenna's presence awakened desires she had spent decades suppressing, feelings that seemed to grow stronger each time she saw him. That evening, as Margaret knelt in her bedroom for her nightly prayers, she found her thoughts drifting away from Scripture and toward the memory of Father McKenna's smile, his voice, the way his hands moved when he spoke. The next afternoon, Margaret arrived at Father McKenna's office 15 minutes early, carrying a folder filled with musical arrangements she had spent hours preparing. She had changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on a navy blue dress that was modest but flattering, and had taken unusual care with her appearance. Father McKenna's office was small but welcoming, with theological books lining the walls and a large wooden desk that dominated the space. When he invited Margaret to sit in the chair across from his desk, she found herself acutely aware of every detail. The way the afternoon light fell across his face, the sound of his breathing, the masculine scent of his cologne. "I've been looking forward to this," Father McKenna said as he settled into his chair. "I have to admit, I'm still learning about the musical traditions at St. Mary's. Your guidance would be invaluable." Margaret felt her pulse quicken at his words. "I've been here so long, I suppose I do know every hymn by heart," she said, attempting a laugh that came out slightly strangled. As they discussed the Easter musical program, Margaret found herself hanging on Father McKenna's every word, studying his expressions and gestures with an intensity that went far beyond professional collaboration. "Your passion for church music is really inspiring," Father McKenna observed as Margaret shared her ideas for special arrangements. "It's clear that this isn't just a job for you, it's a calling." "Music has always been my way of serving God," Margaret replied, though her definition of service was rapidly evolving to include serving Father McKenna as well. "I believe that through music, we can touch people's souls in ways that words alone cannot." Father McKenna nodded thoughtfully. "That's beautifully put. I feel the same way about preaching. There's something sacred about the connection between speaker and congregation." Margaret's breath caught at his words. She wanted desperately to tell him that she felt a sacred connection with him, that his presence in her life had awakened something she thought had died years ago. Instead, she simply nodded and tried to focus on the musical arrangements spread across his desk. But as the meeting continued, Margaret's thoughts became increasingly inappropriate, filled with fantasies about what it would be like to have Father McKenna's undivided attention to be the sole focus of his care and concern. "Margaret, are you feeling all right?" Father McKenna asked with concern. "You seem a bit flushed." The gentle inquiry about her well-being sent a jolt of warmth through Margaret's body. No one had shown such personal concern for her in years, and the fact that it was coming from Father McKenna made it feel like a blessing from heaven itself. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just excited about the musical possibilities for Easter." "Well, I'm certainly excited to work with you," Father McKenna replied. "Your dedication to St. Mary's is remarkable. This congregation is lucky to have you." As Margaret left the office that afternoon, Father McKenna's words echoed in her mind like a sacred mantra. He had called her remarkable, said the congregation was lucky to have her. For someone who had spent her entire adult life feeling invisible and unappreciated, the validation was intoxicating. But what Margaret didn't realize was that her interpretation of Father McKenna's professional kindness was the beginning of an obsession that would transform her from the church's most devoted servant into its most dangerous threat. Over the following weeks, Margaret's behavior began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. She started arriving at the church earlier and staying later, always finding reasons to be present when Father McKenna was working. She volunteered for every committee and activity, positioning herself as his most reliable assistant and confidant. "Margaret's been incredibly helpful," Father McKenna mentioned to the church secretary, Mary Louise Patterson, during their weekly administrative meeting. "She seems to anticipate everything I need before I even know I need it." Mary Louise, who had worked at St. Mary's for 15 years and had watched Margaret's evolution with growing concern, chose her words carefully. "Margaret has always been devoted to the church. Sometimes I think she forgets that there's a world outside these walls." But Mary Louise's gentle warning couldn't capture the full scope of what was happening to Margaret's psyche. The church organist's carefully controlled life was unraveling as her obsession with Father McKenna grew stronger each day. Margaret's home, once a sanctuary of quiet reflection and prayer, had become a shrine to her fixation on Father McKenna. She had begun collecting items with tenuous connections to him: programs from services he had conducted, copies of his sermons, even the paper cup he had used during a church social and accidentally left behind. Her bedroom dresser now held a collection of photographs she had taken surreptitiously during church services, each image capturing Father McKenna in different moments of worship or fellowship. Margaret would study these photos for hours, memorizing every detail of his expressions and imagining scenarios where his attention was focused solely on her. She had also begun keeping a detailed journal of their interactions, recording every conversation they had shared and analyzing his words for hidden meanings and signs of special affection. In Margaret's increasingly distorted thinking, Father McKenna's professional courtesy was evidence of a deeper connection that circumstances prevented him from expressing openly. Margaret's rational mind occasionally tried to assert itself, reminding her that her feelings were inappropriate and potentially destructive. But these moments of clarity were quickly overwhelmed by the intoxicating fantasy that she and Father McKenna shared a special spiritual bond that transcended ordinary relationships. The turning point came during the third week of November. when Father McKenna announced that he would be hosting a small dinner party at the rectory for the church's key volunteers and committee heads. Margaret received an invitation, along with 12 other longtime members of the congregation. "I thought it would be nice to get to know everyone in a more relaxed setting," Father McKenna explained as he handed out the invitations after Sunday service. "Plus, I have to admit, I'm getting a bit lonely eating all my meals alone." Margaret's heart raced at the implication that Father McKenna was lonely and seeking companionship. In her mind, the dinner party became something far more intimate than a simple social gathering. It was an opportunity to demonstrate her domestic skills and show him what life could be like with her by his side. She spent days planning her outfit, settling on a burgundy dress that she thought complemented her graying hair and brought out the color in her eyes. She researched topics of conversation that might interest him and practiced speaking in what she hoped was a more sophisticated and engaging manner. Margaret arrived at the rectory 30 minutes early, carrying a homemade apple pie that she had baked using her grandmother's recipe. She had convinced herself that Father McKenna would appreciate the personal touch and the glimpse into her domestic capabilities. The rectory was a modest 2-story house adjacent to the cathedral, furnished simply but comfortably. Father McKenna greeted Margaret at the door with his characteristic warm smile, accepting her pie with genuine gratitude. "This looks incredible," he said, admiring the perfectly golden crust. "I haven't had homemade pie since I left my mother's house." Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction at being able to provide something that reminded Father McKenna of his mother's care. "I'd be happy to bake for you any time," she said, the offer carrying far more weight than she intended. As the other guests arrived, Margaret found herself studying Father McKenna's interactions with each person, analyzing his expressions and tone for signs of special favor. She was particularly attentive to his conversations with the younger women in the group, feeling a stab of jealousy whenever he laughed at their comments or seemed particularly engaged by their stories. Throughout the evening, Margaret positioned herself as close to Father McKenna as possible, refilling his wine glass, offering to help serve dinner, and inserting herself into every conversation he had with other guests. "Margaret, you're being such a wonderful hostess," Father McKenna observed as she cleared away the dinner plates. "I really appreciate all your help tonight." The comment sent Margaret's imagination soaring. If she was already acting as his hostess, perhaps Father McKenna was beginning to see her as a potential partner in his ministry. The idea that she could be more than just the church organist, that she could be his companion and helpmeet, filled her with a euphoria that made her hands shake as she carried dishes to the kitchen. As the evening wound down and the other guests began to leave, Margaret lingered, finding excuses to stay and help with cleanup. She wanted to prolong her time alone with Father McKenna, to create a moment of intimacy that would mark the beginning of their deeper relationship. "You really don't need to help with all this," Father McKenna said as Margaret insisted on washing the wine glasses by hand. "You've done more than enough already." "I don't mind at all," Margaret replied, her voice taking on a breathless quality. "I enjoy taking care of the rectory." She had almost said, "taking care of you," but caught herself at the last moment, though the implication hung in the air between them. Father McKenna, focused on being a gracious host, missed the underlying intensity in Margaret's offer. But as he watched her move around his kitchen with familiarity and purpose, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the evening felt slightly off. "Margaret," Father McKenna said gently as she finished drying the last glass, "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you do for St. Mary's. Your dedication is really extraordinary." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude and longing. "Working with you has been a blessing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Father McKenna smiled kindly, but Margaret caught something in his expression, a flicker of discomfort or concern that suggested he was beginning to sense the intensity of her feelings. "Well, I should probably let you get home," he said, moving toward the front door in a way that clearly indicated the evening was ending. As Margaret gathered her coat and purse, she felt a desperate need to extend their time together, to create some reason for continued contact. "Father," she said, turning back to him as she reached the door, "I've been working on some special arrangements for the Christmas services. Perhaps we could schedule another meeting to discuss them." The request was perfectly reasonable, But the hunger in Margaret's eyes, as she made it, sent an unmistakable signal that her interest in musical arrangements was secondary to her desire for his attention. "Of course," Father McKenna replied, though his tone had become more formal and distant. "Why don't you email me some dates that work for you, and we'll set something up?" Margaret nodded eagerly, already planning how she would craft the email to maximize their correspondence. As she walked home through the crisp November air, her mind was spinning with fantasies about their upcoming meeting and the deepening relationship she was certain they were developing. But what Margaret didn't know was that Father McKenna had spent the final hour of the evening feeling increasingly uncomfortable with her behavior, and that her obvious infatuation was about to force him to make decisions that would shatter her carefully constructed delusions. The next morning, Father McKenna called Bishop Harrison to discuss what he had observed at the dinner party. As a young priest, he wanted guidance on how to handle a situation that was clearly developing beyond appropriate boundaries. "She seemed fixated," Father McKenna explained to the bishop. "The way she looked at me, the way she positioned herself throughout the evening, the offers to help with personal tasks. I'm concerned that she's developing feelings that go beyond appropriate congregant-pastor relationships." Bishop Harrison, who had dealt with similar situations during his 30 years in church leadership, took the concern seriously. "These situations require very careful handling," he advised. "You need to establish clear professional boundaries immediately before her feelings intensify further." But Margaret's feelings had already intensified, far beyond what Father McKenna or Bishop Harrison could have imagined. The dinner party had not been a warning sign, it had been the moment when her obsession transformed from fantasy into a plan of action. Margaret spent the following week crafting and recrafting her email to Father McKenna about the Christmas musical arrangements. Each draft became longer and more personal, filled with references to their special connection and her unique understanding of his spiritual vision. When she finally sent the email on Friday evening, it was a 3-page document that went far beyond discussing hymns and musical selections. Margaret had poured her heart into the message, describing her feelings about their partnership and her hopes for their continued collaboration in language that was barely coded religious metaphor. Father McKenna received the email on Saturday morning, and its contents left him deeply troubled. Margaret's feelings were no longer subtle or deniable. They were explicit and intense, expressed in language that suggested she believed they were developing a romantic relationship under the guise of professional collaboration. The email ended with a request that chilled Father McKenna to the bone. Margaret had asked if she could move into the rectory's spare bedroom to serve as his personal assistant and spiritual companion, offering to handle all his domestic needs so he could focus entirely on his ministry. Father McKenna immediately contacted Bishop Harrison again, forwarding Margaret's email and explaining that the situation had escalated beyond his ability to handle alone. "This is clearly obsessive behavior," Bishop Harrison said after reviewing the message. "You need to cut off all personal contact immediately and document everything. This woman is not going to accept rejection gracefully." The bishop's words proved prophetic. When Father McKenna responded to Margaret's email with a brief professional message explaining that their relationship must remain strictly within church business, Margaret's reaction was swift and dangerous. Rather than accepting Father McKenna's boundaries, Margaret interpreted his formal response as evidence that others were interfering with their destined relationship. Her obsession shifted from fantasy to fury, and she began planning ways to eliminate the obstacles that were keeping her from the man she believed God had chosen for her. Margaret's first target was Mary Louise Patterson, the church secretary who she believed was poisoning Father McKenna against her. Margaret had noticed the way Mary Louise watched her interactions with Father McKenna, and she was convinced the older woman was spreading malicious gossip about her feelings. Margaret began arriving at the church even earlier, timing her visits to coincide with Mary Louise's daily routines. She would hover near the secretary's office, listening to phone conversations and reading documents left on the desk when Mary Louise stepped away. "I think Margaret's been going through my desk," Mary Louise confided to her husband over dinner. "Things are moved around when I come back from lunch, and she asks me very specific questions about Father McKenna's schedule and personal business." Mary Louise's instincts were correct. Margaret had been systematically gathering information about Father McKenna's daily life, building a detailed picture of his routines, preferences, and vulnerabilities. Margaret had also begun following Father McKenna outside of church hours, learning his patterns and identifying opportunities for accidental encounters. She discovered which grocery store he frequented, where he went for morning walks, and which coffee shop he visited on his days off. Her bedroom had been transformed into a surveillance headquarters with detailed charts tracking Father McKenna's movements and calendar of upcoming church events. Margaret had convinced herself that by understanding every aspect of his life, she could position herself as the perfect partner for his ministry. But Father McKenna was beginning to notice the pattern of coincidental meetings and unexpected appearances. When Margaret showed up at his regular coffee shop 3 days in a row, each time expressing surprise at seeing him there, he realized that his concerns about her behavior were justified. The situation reached a crisis point when Father McKenna discovered Margaret in the rectory one evening, having let herself in with a key she had somehow obtained. She was in his kitchen, preparing dinner and setting the table for two. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" Father McKenna demanded, his voice sharp with alarm and anger. Margaret turned from the stove with a serene smile, as if her presence in his private residence was perfectly natural. "I thought you might be hungry when you got home from evening prayers," she said. "I made your favorite, pot roast with vegetables." Father McKenna felt a chill run down his spine. He had never told Margaret his favorite meal, which meant she had been gathering information about his personal preferences through other means. "Margaret, you cannot be here," he said firmly. "This is my private home, and you don't have permission to enter." "But I want to take care of you," Margaret replied, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "You work so hard for the congregation, and you deserve someone who understands your needs." The conversation that followed revealed the full extent of Margaret's delusions. She genuinely believed that God had brought Father McKenna to St. Mary's specifically for her, and that their relationship was part of a divine plan that others were trying to interfere with. "Margaret, I need you to listen very carefully," Father McKenna said, trying to keep his voice calm and authoritative. "I am a priest. I have taken vows of celibacy, and I cannot have the kind of relationship you're describing with anyone." Margaret's expression darkened at his words. "They've gotten to you," she said, her voice filled with a cold anger that Father McKenna had never heard before. "Mary Louise and the bishop, they've filled your head with lies about me." "No one has said anything about you," Father McKenna replied. "This is about appropriate boundaries and professional conduct." "You felt it too," Margaret insisted, moving closer to him in a way that made him step backward toward the door. "That first day when we met, there was a connection. I know you felt it." Father McKenna realized that reasoning with Margaret was futile. Her perception of reality had become so distorted that she was interpreting his professional kindness as romantic interest, and his attempts to establish boundaries as external manipulation. As Margaret continued to advance toward him, Father McKenna saw something in her eyes that made him understand he was dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. "I think you should leave now," Father McKenna said, reaching for his phone. "We can discuss this tomorrow during regular church hours with other people present." The mention of involving other people triggered something explosive in Margaret's psyche. She lunged toward Father McKenna, grabbing for his phone while shouting about conspiracies and interference with God's plan. Father McKenna managed to push Margaret away and escape from the rectory, but the incident left him shaken and convinced that Margaret's obsession had become dangerous. He immediately called the police and Bishop Harrison, realizing that the situation was beyond the church's ability to handle internally. But Margaret's reaction to being rejected and reported to authorities would prove that Father McKenna's concerns about her dangerous mental state were tragically accurate. The police response to Father McKenna's call was professional, but limited. Without evidence of physical violence or explicit threats, they could only file a report and advise him to obtain a restraining order if Margaret's behavior continued. "We see this kind of thing more often than you'd think," Officer Janet Muller explained as she took Father McKenna's statement. "Religious figures sometimes attract people who confuse spiritual guidance with personal relationships. Most of the time, a firm warning resolves the situation, but Officer Muller's optimism was misplaced. Margaret Sinclair was not most people, and her response to being officially reported would escalate far beyond what anyone in Cedarbrook could have imagined. Margaret spent the night after the rectory confrontation in a state of manic planning. In her mind, Father McKenna's rejection was not evidence that her feelings were inappropriate, but proof that evil forces were working against their divine union. She became convinced that drastic action was required to save both Father McKenna and their relationship. Margaret's journal entries from that night revealed a mind completely disconnected from reality, filled with references to biblical battles between good and evil, and her role as God's chosen instrument to protect Father McKenna from his enemies. Her first act of retaliation came Sunday morning, when Margaret arrived at St. Mary's 2 hours before service and systematically sabotaged the organ. She removed key components and rearranged others, ensuring that the instrument would fail spectacularly during the service. When the congregation gathered for worship and the organ produced only discordant noise instead of hymns, Margaret positioned herself as the concerned victim rather than the perpetrator. "I don't understand what could have happened," she told Father McKenna with apparent distress. "Everything was fine when I practiced yesterday evening." Father McKenna, still rattled from the previous night's encounter, studied Margaret's face for signs of deception. But her performance was flawless. She appeared genuinely upset about the organ's malfunction and eager to help solve the problem. What Father McKenna couldn't know was that Margaret had spent hours practicing her reaction to the sabotage, perfecting the innocent confusion that would deflect suspicion while creating chaos that would require her expertise to resolve. "We'll have to conduct the service without music," Father McKenna announced to the congregation. "I apologize for this unexpected disruption." As the congregation struggled through an uncomfortable and awkward service without musical accompaniment, Margaret watched Father McKenna's obvious distress with satisfaction. She had demonstrated how essential her presence was to the smooth operation of St. Mary's, while also showing what could happen when people tried to interfere with her role in the church. After the service, Margaret approached Father McKenna with apparent concern. "Father, I know someone who can repair the organ quickly," she offered. "It would probably take the regular technician weeks to schedule us, but I have a personal contact who could fix it today." Father McKenna felt trapped by the offer. The church needed the organ repaired, and refusing Margaret's help would seem petty and unreasonable to the other parishioners who were observing their interaction. "That would be helpful," he said reluctantly. "Thank you." Margaret's smile at his acceptance was radiant, and Father McKenna realized with growing dread that she had interpreted his gratitude as evidence that their relationship was returning to its previous warmth. The repair technician Margaret brought to the church was actually her cousin Eddie, a handyman she had enlisted by telling him the organ had suffered accidental damage. Eddie completed the repairs quickly and professionally, never suspecting that he was helping to cover up deliberate sabotage. As Eddie worked, Margaret positioned herself as Father McKenna's liaison, translating technical explanations and coordinating the repair process. To the casual observer, she appeared to be simply helpful and knowledgeable. But Father McKenna could feel the intensity of her attention and the possessive way she managed every aspect of the situation. "There," Margaret announced as Eddie finished the final adjustments. "Good as new. We should be able to practice together tomorrow afternoon to make sure everything is working properly." The suggestion of a private practice session sent alarm bells ringing in Father McKenna's mind. He realized that Margaret was using the organ sabotage to create opportunities for continued contact, despite his attempts to establish boundaries. "I think we should wait until the next regular service to test the repairs," Father McKenna said carefully. "With the full congregation present, we'll be able to hear how it sounds in actual worship conditions." Margaret's expression flickered with disappointment and anger before she regained control. Father McKenna caught the momentary lapse in her mask and realized that her helpful demeanor was becoming increasingly difficult for her to maintain. That evening, Father McKenna received a phone call that would push Margaret's obsession into its final deadly phase. Bishop Harrison called to inform him that the diocese was transferring him to a larger parish in Nashville, effective at the end of the month. "Given the situation you've described with this organist," Bishop Harrison explained, "we think it's best to remove you from the environment before things escalate further. The new assignment will be good for your career, and distance should resolve the personal complications. Father McKenna felt relief at the prospect of escaping Margaret's increasingly unstable behavior, but he also worried about what would happen to the congregation of St. Mary's after his departure. "What about Margaret?" he asked. "Will the new pastor be warned about her behavior?" "We'll handle that appropriately," Bishop Harrison assured him. "Your job is to finish your remaining responsibilities and prepare for the transfer." But when word of Father McKenna's impending departure reached Margaret through the church's administrative channels, her reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Margaret learned about Father McKenna's transfer when she overheard Mary Louise Patterson discussing the paperwork with the diocesan office. The news hit her like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about the conspiracy she believed was working against their relationship. That night, Margaret's journal entries took on an apocalyptic tone, filled with references to martyrdom and the need to take dramatic action to prevent Father McKenna's enemies from destroying their divine connection. "They think they can separate us," she wrote in increasingly erratic handwriting, "but they don't understand that some bonds are stronger than human interference. If we cannot be together in this world, then we will be united in the next." The entry ended with a detailed plan for ensuring that Father McKenna would never leave St. Mary's or her behind. Margaret spent the following day making meticulous preparations for what she had convinced herself would be a romantic suicide pact that would reunite her and Father McKenna in eternal love. She purchased items that could be used to create a gas leak in the rectory, researching methods that would appear accidental while ensuring that both she and Father McKenna would die together. In Margaret's distorted thinking, their deaths would prove the depth of their connection and serve as a testimony to true love that would inspire future generations. She imagined their story becoming a tragic romance celebrated by the congregation, with their graves side by side in the church cemetery. Her plan was to enter the rectory during Father McKenna's evening prayer time, disable the gas safety mechanisms, and then present him with what she believed would be an irresistible romantic gesture: the opportunity to choose love over duty by dying with her rather than leaving Cedarbrook alone. But Margaret's plan required her to obtain access to the rectory, and Father McKenna had changed the locks after their previous confrontation. Margaret's solution demonstrated the cunning that had been hidden beneath her pious exterior for years. She approached Eddie, her handyman cousin, with a story about Father McKenna asking her to coordinate some emergency repairs to the rectory's heating system. "He's been having trouble with gas smells," Margaret lied smoothly. "The church wants me to let you in tonight to check the connections before someone gets hurt." Eddie, who trusted Margaret and had no reason to question her story, agreed to meet her at the rectory that evening with his tools and a key he had been given for previous maintenance work. Margaret spent the day in a state of manic excitement, preparing what she believed would be her final love letter to Father McKenna, a document that explained their destiny and the beautiful death they would share together. As evening approached and Margaret prepared to implement her deadly plan, she had no idea that Father McKenna had grown suspicious of the day's events and had contacted the police about his concerns. Father McKenna's suspicions were triggered when Eddie called him directly to confirm the details about the gas leak repair work. When Father McKenna explained that he had never reported any gas problems or requested any repairs, both men immediately realized that Margaret had manipulated the situation. "She told me you asked specifically for this work to be done tonight," Eddie said, his voice tight with concern. "Said it was an emergency that couldn't wait." Father McKenna felt his blood run cold as he realized the implications. Margaret's behavior had been escalating steadily, and her ability to manipulate others into helping with her schemes suggested that she was planning something far more dangerous than previous incidents. "Do not meet her at the rectory," Father McKenna said urgently. "I'm calling the police right now." Officer Mowiller, who had taken Father McKenna's original complaint about Margaret, responded immediately to his emergency call. She coordinated with backup units to surround the rectory and requested assistance from the county's crisis intervention team. But Margaret was already inside the rectory, having used Eddie's key to gain entry before he realized he had been deceived. When police arrived at the scene, they found a situation far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Margaret had been working for over an hour to create what she believed would be a romantic death scene worthy of their great love story. She had disabled multiple gas safety mechanisms and filled the rectory with dangerous levels of natural gas, turning the building into a potential bomb that could level several surrounding structures. When police officers approached the rectory, they could immediately smell the gas and recognize the extreme danger of the situation. Any spark, from electrical equipment, static electricity, or even a cell phone, could trigger an explosion that would kill Margaret, destroy the rectory, and potentially damage the cathedral itself. "This is Officer Muller with the Cedarbrook Police," she announced through a megaphone from a safe distance. "Margaret, we know you're inside and we want to help you, but you need to turn off the gas and come out immediately." Margaret's response came through an open window, her voice carrying a dreamy quality that suggested she was already being affected by gas inhalation. "It's too late for help," she called out. "Father McKenna and I are going to be together forever, just like God intended. When he comes home for evening prayers, we'll both find peace." The realization that Margaret was planning to kill Father McKenna along with herself sent the emergency response into high gear. Gas company technicians were called to shut off service to the entire block, while crisis negotiators worked to convince Margaret to abandon her deadly plan. "Margaret, Father McKenna doesn't want to die," Officer Muller called out. "He wants to live and continue his ministry. You can show your love for him by making sure he stays safe." "You don't understand," Margaret replied, her voice becoming more slurred as the gas concentration increased. "They're sending him away from me. If we can't be together here, we have to go together to heaven." The negotiation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Margaret becoming increasingly incoherent as gas inhalation affected her cognitive function. Crisis specialists tried every approach they could think of, appealing to her religious beliefs, her concern for the congregation, and her desire to prove her love for Father McKenna. Finally, as Margaret's responses became more erratic and the gas levels reached critical concentrations, emergency responders realized they had no choice but to attempt a forced entry before the entire building exploded. The rescue operation required split-second timing and extraordinary courage from the officers involved. Using specialized equipment that wouldn't create sparks, they managed to break into the rectory and locate Margaret, who was unconscious on the living room floor, surrounded by the materials she had planned to use in her murder-suicide. Margaret was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, her lungs damaged by prolonged gas inhalation and her mental state completely fractured by the failure of her plan. As she was loaded into the ambulance, she kept repeating Father McKenna's name and asking why he hadn't come to join her. The rectory was declared uninhabitable and would require months of repairs before it could be safely occupied again. Father McKenna, who had watched the entire crisis unfold from the police command post, was shaken by how close he had come to being murdered by someone he had tried to help. In the aftermath of Margaret's attempted murder-suicide, the congregation of St. Mary's was forced to confront the reality that their beloved organist had been hiding a dangerous obsession that nearly destroyed their church and killed their pastor. Margaret Sinclair's trial became a media sensation that drew attention from across Tennessee and beyond. The case highlighted the dangerous potential of religious obsession and the way mental illness could hide behind a facade of piety and devotion. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Margaret had been suffering from erotomania, a delusional belief that another person was in love with her, complicated by religious mania and a history of suppressed sexual feelings that had erupted with destructive force when triggered by Father McKenna's presence. Miss Sinclair genuinely believed that God had chosen her and Father McKenna for a special spiritual union, Dr. Patricia Wells testified during the trial. When reality conflicted with this delusion, she became convinced that evil forces were interfering with divine will. Margaret's defense team argued for an insanity plea, presenting evidence of her deteriorating mental state and complete break from reality. Prosecutors, however, emphasized the premeditation and cunning that had gone into her various schemes, arguing that she retained enough cognitive function to be held responsible for her actions. The jury's verdict reflected the complexity of the case. Margaret was found guilty of attempted murder and multiple counts of endangering others, but was sentenced to life in a secure psychiatric facility rather than a traditional prison, Father McKenna completed his transfer. Father McKenna completed his transfer to Nashville as planned, but the experience at St. Mary's left him permanently changed. He underwent extensive counseling to deal with the trauma of being stalked and nearly murdered, and he implemented strict professional boundaries in his new parish that some parishioners found cold and distant. "I learned that kindness can be misinterpreted," Father McKenna told Bishop Harrison during one of their follow-up meetings. "Now I'm probably too careful, too formal with everyone, but I can't risk another situation like Margaret." The congregation at St. Mary's struggled to rebuild their sense of safety and trust. Many longtime members left the church, unable to reconcile their memories of Margaret's gentle organ playing with the knowledge of her deadly obsession. The new pastor, Father Rodriguez, faced the challenge of healing a community that had been shattered by betrayal from within. Mary Louise Patterson, who had tried to warn Father McKenna about Margaret's behavior, felt guilt and responsibility for not acting more decisively. "I saw the signs," she told investigators. "I should have done more to protect him, to protect all of us." But perhaps the most tragic victim of Margaret's obsession was Margaret herself, a woman whose genuine faith and musical talent had been corrupted by mental illness into something monstrous. Dr. Wells, who continued to treat Margaret at the psychiatric facility, worked to understand how someone with no previous history of violence could plan such an elaborate murder-suicide scheme. Margaret's entire identity was built around serving God through her music, Dr. Wells explained in her case notes. When Father McKenna's presence awakened sexual feelings she had suppressed for decades, her mind couldn't process the conflict between her desires and her religious beliefs. Margaret's delusion that God had chosen her and Father McKenna for a special union was her psyche's attempt to resolve the impossible contradiction between her physical attraction to him and her understanding of appropriate Christian behavior. In the secure facility, Margaret continued to insist that she and Father McKenna were spiritually married, and she spent hours each day writing letters to him that were never sent. Her room was decorated with religious imagery, but staff noticed that she had altered many of the images to include herself alongside biblical figures. 5 years after the crisis at St. Mary's, Margaret remained convinced that she had acted out of love and divine guidance. Her inability to recognize the horror of her actions suggested that her break from reality was permanent and complete. The case of Margaret Sinclair became required reading at seminaries across the country, used to train young clergy about the warning signs of obsessive behavior and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. The incident highlighted how religious environments could provide cover for dangerous mental illness when congregations were reluctant to question someone's apparent devotion. Father McKenna eventually left the priesthood entirely, finding that he could no longer trust his ability to distinguish between genuine faith and dangerous obsession in his parishioners. He became a high school teacher, working with teenagers whose emotional transparency seemed safer than the complex psychological dynamics of adult congregations. "I thought I was called to help people find God," he reflected years later. "But I learned that sometimes people use God to justify their darkest impulses, and there's no amount of theological training that prepares you for that." The organ at St. Mary's was eventually repaired and returned to service, but it was never quite the same. Some members of the congregation claimed they could still hear something unsettling in its tone, a reminder of the woman who had played it with such skill while harboring such darkness in her heart. Eddie, Margaret's cousin who had unwittingly helped her gain access to the rectory, struggled with guilt and self-recrimination for years after the incident. He had provided the key that nearly enabled a double murder, and the knowledge that his trust had been manipulated for such deadly purposes haunted him. "Margaret was always the religious one in the family," he told investigators. "She seemed so pure, so devoted to the church. I never imagined she was capable of something like this." The incident forced the entire Cedar Brook community to re-examine their assumptions about the people they thought they knew. Margaret had been a fixture at St. Mary's for 30 years, trusted and respected by generations of parishioners who had never suspected the psychological time bomb ticking beneath her pious exterior. Church security protocols were completely overhauled following Margaret's attempted murder-suicide. Background checks became mandatory for all volunteers, and clergy were trained to recognize the warning signs of obsessive behavior before it escalated to dangerous levels. The psychological evaluation of Margaret revealed disturbing details about her long-suppressed sexuality and the way her religious beliefs had become twisted into justification for possessive behavior. She had been attracted to several previous pastors at St. Mary's, but had managed to suppress those feelings through prayer and self-denial. Father McKenna's youth and charisma had overwhelmed her psychological defenses, triggering an avalanche of repressed desires that her mind could only process through religious delusion. In her distorted thinking, God had finally sent her the love she had been denied for so many years. Dr. Wells's treatment notes revealed that Margaret had constructed an elaborate internal mythology around her relationship with Father McKenna, complete with biblical parallels and prophetic significance. She genuinely believed that their union was part of God's plan for salvation, and that anyone who opposed their relationship was working for Satan. This level of delusional thinking explained why Margaret had been willing to commit murder. In her mind, she wasn't planning to kill Father McKenna, but to liberate him from earthly constraints so they could be together in eternal glory. The impact on Father McKenna's family was devastating. His parents, who had been so proud of their son's calling to the priesthood, struggled to understand how their child's dedication to serving God had nearly cost him his life. "We always worried about him working in dangerous neighborhoods or with troubled people," his mother told reporters. "We never imagined the danger would come from inside the church itself, from someone who seemed so devoted to faith." Father McKenna's departure from the priesthood was a source of ongoing grief for his family, who saw his calling as a gift from God that had been stolen by Margaret's obsession. They blamed themselves for not recognizing the warning signs during their visits to Cedarbrook, when Margaret had always been present and helpful. The ripple effects of Margaret's actions extended far beyond the immediate victims, damaging faith communities and families who had believed that churches were sanctuaries from the world's dangers. 10 years after the incident, St. Mary's Cathedral still bore the scars of Margaret Sinclair's obsession. The congregation had never fully recovered its previous size or sense of community, and the rectory remained empty. Subsequent pastors chose to live elsewhere, rather than occupy the building where Margaret had planned her murder-suicide. The organ, despite multiple repairs and retunings, never sounded quite right to longtime parishioners. Some claimed it was mechanical damage from Margaret's sabotage, while others believed the instrument retained some spiritual imprint of the darkness that had possessed its former player. Margaret herself remained in the psychiatric facility, her condition unchanged despite years of treatment. She continued to write daily letters to Father McKenna, filled with religious imagery and declarations of eternal love. The letters revealed a mind trapped in a delusion so complete that reality could not penetrate it. Her case became a landmark study in religious-based erotomania, cited in psychology textbooks, and used to train mental health professionals about the dangerous intersection of sexual obsession and spiritual delusion. Dr. Wells published a comprehensive study of Margaret's case that became required reading for seminary students and church administrators. The research highlighted how traditional religious communities often lack the psychological training to recognize when apparent devotion crossed the line into dangerous obsession. Margaret Sinclair appeared to be the ideal parishioner, Dr. Wells wrote in her conclusion. Her dedication, her musical talent, and her apparent selflessness made her invaluable to the church community. But these same qualities masked a psychological fragility that made her vulnerable to obsessive attachment when the right triggers appeared. The case prompted many religious organizations to implement new training programs for clergy and lay leaders, focusing on recognizing the warning signs of unhealthy attachment and establishing appropriate professional boundaries. But for the victims of Margaret's obsession, Father McKenna, the congregation of St. Mary's, and Margaret herself, no amount of policy change could undo the damage that had been done when faith became twisted into something deadly. Father McKenna, now known simply as Thomas McKenna, eventually found peace in his work as a high school history teacher. He married a fellow teacher and started a family, building a life far removed from the religious community that had once been his calling. "I still believe in God," he reflected during a rare interview about his experience. "But I learned that belief can be corrupted by human psychology in ways that turn love into obsession and faith into justification for terrible acts." He never returned to Cedarbrook, and he asked that his current location not be made public. The fear that Margaret might somehow escape or that other disturbed individuals might seek him out remained a constant concern. The empty rectory at St. Mary's stood as a monument to the destruction that could result when religious devotion became infected with dangerous obsession, a reminder that evil could hide behind the most innocent facades, even in the holiest places. Margaret Sinclair had begun as the perfect church organist, beloved by her congregation and devoted to her faith. But when her suppressed desires encountered the wrong catalyst, her devotion transformed into something that nearly destroyed everything she claimed to love. Her unholy obsession had turned a house of worship into a potential crime scene and a servant of God into a would-be murderer. In the end, Margaret's greatest tragedy was not that she had fallen in love with someone she couldn't have, but that her inability to accept reality had cost her everything she genuinely valued: her music, her faith community, and ultimately her freedom and sanity. The church organist's unholy obsession had taught Cedarbrook a lesson that no congregation should ever have to learn: that the most dangerous predators are often those who seem the most devoted to the very institutions they ultimately seek to destroy. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.